Добрый день.
Hello,
Теперь уже более осмысленное выражение лица, более серьезный добрый день.
and now more
Спасибо
officially, let me
большое, что
say
вы с нами.
hello.
Спасибо и
Thank you for
вашей
being here, for joining
Славе.
us. Thank you, Yasha,
Мы сегодня
for
говорим
being
про
the
недавно
speaker for
совсем
today's
вышедшую
call.
книжку.
And we will focus on the very recently
И
published
как она
book.
называется по-русски? У
What
меня
is
есть
its
уже
Russian title?
утвержденное
Is
название.
there an approved Russian title of the book?
Добрый день, доброе утро.
Yes,
Спасибо
hello.
вам большое, что
Good morning.
в этот день вы здесь.
Thank you for spending this day on this call. Thank you, Oля, for inviting me and to join this very interesting series of seminars. Yes, the Russian title exists.
Tamizdat, контрабандная русская литература в эпоху холодной войны.
Tamizdat, Contraband Russian Literature of the Cold War era.
Спасибо.
Thank you.
Я тогда вместо того, чтобы тебя представить и сказать все твои позиции и регалии, вместо того, чтобы сказать, что
Instead
ты
of
учился
introducing
в
all of your
Бостоне, что ты
affiliations
закончил Хэмптон-колледж,
positions,
что
that
ты
you've
руководитель
graduated
проекта Tamizdat
in Boston
Project,
and associated with Compton
да,
College, and you lead the
я сразу
Tamizdat project,
перейду к
I will move
вопросу,
swiftly to
самому,
the
мне кажется,
question,
такому напрашивающемуся.
the most
Почему
obvious one.
контрабандная
Why
литература? Потому что,
Why
когда
do you
я
call
смотрю
it a
4 главы
contraband
твоей
literature? Because when
книжки,
I read the 4 chapters of your book
Solzhenitsyn,
on
Akhmatova,
Solzhenitsyn, Akhmatova, Chukovskaya,
Шаламов.
and Shalamov,
4 главы авторы
four literature
писали о
for
репрессии.
four
И
authors
книгу можно было назвать
who
вообще
wrote
по-другому
about
и совершенно
repressions.
другое
The
ранжирование.
title of the book could have been very
С
different
другой
and it could have been
стороны,
arranged differently,
контрабандная
but on the other hand,
литература, тут
you
вопрос
use the
не в том,
expression
что
contraband
какие
literature.
именно технически
How
эти
technically
произведения передавались
these
на Запад,
works, these
как
texts were moved to the
кто
West,
вывозил
forwarded to the
эти
West,
тексты,
who
кто
took them out,
договаривался
who
с конкретным журналом,
who
что
arranged with
издание
particular
произведения
periodical that this particular
там.
text is going to be published
Было
there.
ли такое, что журнал говорил, нет, спасибо, нам это
Has there
слишком
ever been
интересно, не
cases that the
годится?
journal would say,
То есть
magazine would
как
say, this is text, it's not for
распределялись
us? So
зоны интереса и
how
какие-то выстраивались
how
ли
the
какие-то
interest zones were
связи?
arranged and how the connections were made.
Спасибо, да. На
Thank
самом
you.
деле
Yes.
здесь, мне кажется, два вопроса. Один
These are
абсолютно
two questions, and
книга на
quite
тему как бы нарративов
correctly,
ГУЛАГа,
the
сталинизма,
it's a
даже если
it's a book. We're talking about narratives around Gulag, Stalinism, even though some chapters of the book
об Ахматовой,
are or on Akhmatova,
лишь
who
потеряла там двух мужей и
just merely lost two husbands
и так далее, да, то
and
есть,
so on,
но сама все-таки
but
писала не
herself
изнутри
was not writing from within the
Союза.
camps, from outside, from the
Почему такая
so-called free world.
тематическая рамка в этой книжке? Ну,
So why I'm using
что,
this
конечно
thematic
же,
frame for
Gulag
this
и
book?
сталинизм был
Because Gulag and Stalinism were the most burning issue of the Cold War.
не только даже поэтому, еще
And not just because of that, but
в регистрации этого опыта
in the registration and
воплощались
in the registration of this experience,
принципиально новые как бы способы, да, писать,
new means of writing were
стилистические,
tried
стилистические,
and used, stylistic methods.
которые, конечно же, были
So some characteristics of those particular texts
самого опыта
that were the also result of that particular experience, that catastrophic
за
experience.
пределами
That experience,
там Восточной Европы, Советского Союза, то есть по
which
внешней
outside
стороне
of Eastern Europe and Soviet Union,
занавеса, как ни
so on the other side of the Iron Curtain, no one had such experience.
это создавало такую
And that
коммуникативную проблему.
created a communication challenge or even a barrier,
Особенно в случае с Шаламовым.
especially in the case of Shalamov.
4 главы в книжке.
4 chapters in the book, besides the general historic and theoretic introduction, and not counting the epilogue, the 4 chapters in the book on Solzhenitsyn, and I'll say a few words why about him, on Akhmatova, mostly about Requiem, but also Hurla's poem as a prequel to Requiem.
Чуковская, это обе ее повести, не только Софья Петровна, но и «Спуск под воду».
Chukovskaya, also her novels, including The Going Underwater and Shalamov.
Коммуникативная проблема, конечно, может быть, достигала,
and in the case of Shalamov,
максимальных
the communication challenge was the strongest, because this is connected to the aesthetics of Shalamov, and it's a whole separate conversation. But the new prose of Shalamov, it is written completely different from what we are used to reading, or were used to reading in the memoirs. So his memoirs of the campus experience is different. May I interrupt you? Then why the socialist realism of Solzhenitsyn was accepted? Well, that's a question not to me, probably, why it was accepted, but to me, the understanding of social reason on both sides of either Iron Curtain, by the immigration and in the Soviet Union itself, is important because it underlines the status quo, against the backdrop of which one can notice that there are idiosyncratic peculiarities of the writings of Shalamov himself. So the first chapter is not just about Solzhenitsyn, but about Ivan Denisovich. So about the publication of this revolutionary work in the Soviet world. And it's not 1957 when it is everyone is considering the starting date of Tamizdat by publication of Dr. Zhivago in Italy. But in terms of the literature about the camps, I see the starting point as the 1962, the publication of Solzhenitsyn, and not outside of the country, but inside the country. Because against the backdrop of this socialistic, the socialist realism method of Ivan Denisovich, that's the only reason why it could be published. But Sofia Petrovna by Chukovskaya, which was completely different. But the manuscript goes to Twardowski together with Ivan Denisovich. Not even soon afterwards, but together. So this is because this is why, while in 1962-63, Akhmatova and Chukovskaya and everyone writing on the camps and the Gulag issues, they hoped that that Ivan Denisovich would open the way for those works to the state publishing system. And actually, it says, Olga says, actually, it closed that path. It kind of filled the niche. But how does then the Western reader get to know Ivan Denisovich? Through Novy Mir. So in that direction, there were no problems. So there were reviews immediately. Reviews, but even pre-publication reviews. So some kind of forerunners of the publication itself. Yevtushenki, the heirs of Stalin, were published a year prior to that, in 1961. So in Pravda. So it's a culmination, the finale, with the publication of Ivan Denisovich in New World, Novy Mir. So the reviewers of Soviet press in the West didn't have the problem that, for example, the dissidents who didn't immediately get to learn of what was published on the other side of the curtain. So it was more of a one-way communication. But Ivan Denisovich, in the matter of months, maybe in 2 months, was being reprinted outside of Soviet Union, but also reprinted in state publishing system of Soviet Union, because it was published initially in Novy Mir, and then Roman Gazeta, and then as a separate book. And in Tamizdat it was printed in January 1963. It's a photostat. so a copy of from Novemir. But it was published by Fligon Publishing House in London, obviously without the consent or even informing the author. And then one more publishing house, one more copy of that, also by Fligon. And numerous reactions and reviews followed. Not only in the Soviet Union, but also in the immigration after Solzhenitsyn, everyone thought that this will open a whole new era of publishing. But as we know, the history of the 1962 and the Manege exhibition and December events, things are changing. And how did the Western readers respond? Or maybe let's separate the questions. How did the readers in the West and when Russian-speaking immigrant readers respond to Ivan Denisovich? We can see a split or even a schism between the form and the content, but then they support each other, as it's common in the reception. I mean,
востребованной, да, в 62-3 году.
Because that topic was very much relevant and important for that particular moment. But the method of conveying it to the readers, it becomes finally accessible. Ivan Denisovich is very accessible for the immigrant readers. Especially the first wave, which on the one hand didn't have their own experience, which was already the experience of the immigrants of the second or third wave. So it all seemed very true and realistic. But it didn't seem realistic to Shalamov. It is known that his comment about the cat being alive, going through the barracks in Ivan Denisovich. On the other hand, it caused no doubts in the realistic portrayal of the situation. But on the other side, again, it was social realism. So it kind of contributed, it answered to the need of some life-affirming going into the light. As we know, Ivan Denisovich is finishing. We know the ending of Ivan Denisovich, and it's always, we have to remember that this is a must. It's what is, I'm talking about what is literally in the text and not between the lines. Solzhenitsyn, the one day of Ivan Denisovich is ending on the kind of an optimistic note. Almost a clear day, almost a happy day. Almost happy day. And the almost speaks to an educated reader. The word almost conveys more than the happy word. If I remember correctly, in that chapter of your book, someone responded, "There's nothing too new for us about the camps." Well, what new is there for us, especially for those who have read Solzhenitsyn? What new can we learn about the camps here? But quite an arrogant thing to say, but these people will learn a lot of new stuff about the Gulag from Shalamov's new prose. So what I want to say is that this ascending tone of voice of Solzhenitsyn, this optimistic ending was interestingly falling on the grounds of immigrants' reception. So it was not the socialist realism of what Khrushchev required from the writers, like to show the path and give light to the way at the Congress of the Union of Writers. That writers, their role is to show the way.
Солженицын закрыл дорогу в печать.
You say that Solzhenitsyn kind of blocked the way to being published to other authors because everything has been said about these concentration camps. Would it be fair to say that something similar was taking place in the West? If we compare the reception of Solzhenitsyn, Akhmatova, Chukovskaya, can I ask you about that? This did resonate in the West as well. There were no such very rigid rules about what you could and couldn't publish. So you could not publish Sofia Petrovna simply for literary reasons. Because the first part of the novel kind of looks like a story of some moral rise. And it's not like it's cut off, but towards the end of the novel, it completely goes downhill. And this is simply formally unacceptable, according to some regulations. Of course, it could be published abroad, and it was published abroad. But if we compare it to Ivan Denisovich, there are so many reasons. So the gender aspect of it plays a role. Who was trusted to speak on this issue? Who was trusted to speak on behalf of the victims of the Stalin repressions? Of course, it had to be not just a peasant or a member of the Red Army. It had to be a man. It had to be a middle-aged man. Are you talking about the socialist realism or about the West? I'm talking about both. So the difference is, and this is what I was most interested in, I wanted to find certain patterns, some horizons of expectations, if you want, if you like. From the theory of perception, in Tamizdat, in emigration, these kinds of rules were not as rigid, unlike in the Soviet Union, where this was very well regulated. We know that there have been speeches and articles, almost instructions, that came from the party, from the writers themselves. In Tamizdat, of course, we didn't have that. There were no booklets with instructions of what to write and how to write. And there was still some horizon of expectations that were yet to be formulated. It was very interesting to find them and to put them into words, because there are certain reflexes that are governed by some factors, cultural and social. And perhaps these rules were not as vague as, say, socialist realism would dictate. Because there were certain sensibilities that the readers displayed, particularly those who emigrated and who fled from the concentration camps, or from the bigger camp, if you like, from the Soviet Union. If we look at the years, in January 1963, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich comes out. In 1963, Akhmatova is published in Munich. Well, there's a 1 year difference between them. After that, Lydia Chukovskaya is published. Are there any waves of reader interest that we can track? There's Solzhenitsyn and Akhmatova. How does she look, against the backdrop of Solzhenitsyn? Is it possible to compare them in terms of their reception? Are they completely different and incomparable? What do the critics say? Do the critics compare Akhmatova and Solzhenitsyn, or is it something completely different? Akhmatova is a bit of a different story. Chukovskaya is a bit more of a vivid example that can be compared with Ivan Denisovich, because the genre is comparable. It's not a cycle of poetry. And also the plot. It's more challenging with Akhmatova, because unlike Lydia Chukovskaya, because Chukovskaya was known as the daughter of Kornei Chukovsky, Akhmatova, on the other hand, was known pretty much by everyone. She was easily recognized as the early Akhmatova, the pre-revolution Akhmatova, the wife of Gumilov. And you write that she was not forgiven for her poetry of 1910. So unlike those who kind of found refuge in under these foreign wings, as she writes. At that level, the reception of Requiem is unique. Few people addressed such 4 lines to the immigration as Akhmatova did. And there are historical reasons for this. This was not the only 4 lines that she wrote. She wrote starting from 1917. She has several such texts where she writes that I am not with those who left the motherland. She has these kinds of poems about her motherland. And how did people find out about her? They knew about her. They knew her poetry that was written in a moment of despair. Those poems that were published in 1952, there was an ode to Stalin. Of course, she refused to include those poems into her books of poetry. And in the 1960s, this posed a challenge for the publishers, because they weren't sure whether to include those poems or not, but those poems were well known as well. And if we take into account this story of Akhmatova and immigration, so her pre-immigration years have the same weight as her immigration years. This is very different compared to, let's say, Shalamov, who does not have such a story. So Akhmatova is a kind of standalone specimen.
Это достигает, ну, воплощается, что ли, вот уже в таких буквально встречах или не встречах. В 65-м, например,
And in 1965,
в Оксфорд
when Akhmatova comes to Oxford
почетную докторскую степень,
to get her honorary PhD,
и со своими издателями,
she meets her publishers, the publishers of Requiem, that was published 2 years prior to that.
ну, бывшими или друзьями, буквально
There she meets her former friends, her pre-revolution friends. So 50 years have gone by, and this is the first time they come face to face with Einenkov, the one who did her portrait.
Ну вот. С Чуковской, да, пример лучше для сопоставления.
As for Chukovskaya, she's perhaps a better example to compare with Solzhenitsyn.
С другой стороной, сопоставление с Солженицыным, или скорее фон Солженицына, на котором мы можем...
So against the backdrop of Solzhenitsyn, we can have a clear view of the stories from Kolyma concentration camp by Varlam Shalamov.
Ну, методологически это сравнение происходит другим образом с Шаламовым.
So the comparison with Shalamov is going to be methodologically different, though. Do you understand correctly that somebody, so let's say Chukovskaya, consciously hands over her text?
Вот ты разбираешь авторов, да, как их тексты...
So you are looking at several authors. My question is, how did their texts get to the emigration? So Solzhenitsyn had no chance because he was published in Novy Mir and he was just reprinted. Ivan Denisovich was written in 1959, and it was 3 years until it was published in Novy Mir. And Solzhenitsyn does write how he tried to prevent this manuscript to be sent out somewhere. He did not want this manuscript to be leaked abroad, because in that case, if it did, then he would not be published in the Soviet Union. So this was a bit of an issue for Solzhenitsyn. As for the various manuscripts, their situation can be different. There's no single path that everybody follows. As for those who were involved in this process, these are various agents, literally and figuratively, agents of cultural production. We don't give their names, but rather their professional roles. These were diplomats. Diplomatic mail is how Requiem got abroad. And to be honest, I still don't know how Sofia Petrovna ended up in Paris.
Воля. Как
Не
она...
As
Akhmatova.
for the Requiem, whose decision it was, whose will was it? Not Akhmatova's. She authentically, she genuinely didn't know about this.
Насколько известно, мы еще все-таки далеко не все знаем.
And as much as we know, and we don't know everything by now about Akhmatova's life,
дневниковые записи самой Ахматовой и Чуковской.
but there are journal entries from Akhmatova and Chukovskaya's journal entries about her. If we reconstruct the events based on those entries, it happens even in a month in December 1963. She takes out a volume of the Requiem and shows it to Chukovskaya, and it happened actually, it was published in 1963 November, so it took a month for it to get to her. not so long, but it was actually kept being done in secrecy from her. And the most interesting story about Requiem here, it's dramatic not just because of Akhmatova, but also because other people involved. For the very first time, the Requiem, it didn't exist on paper. It existed in the memory of 11 people since the 1930s. And in 1962, it remained paperless still, and not just not being printed, even though some of her poems were printed. But for the first time, she puts it on paper in 2 weeks after Ivan Denisovich is published. So it happens on the 6th of December on 1962 in Moscow. And this newly transcribed or typed text, she herself sent to Twardowski, to Nowy Mir, where it is rejected, not taken into printing, and then in geometric progression, it's starting to circulate in Tamizdat. Gerbanevska remembers that already by March of 1963, there were already around 1,000 copies that were circulating from person to person. But starting with the same March 1963, in Moscow, there's a family of the scientists from California. It was the scientific exchange programs that started between the US and the USSR since 1958. So answering your questions, who took part besides the diplomats, the cultural attachés, and the embassy staff, there were also scientists participating, for example, some postgraduate students and journalists, of course. In the case of Requiem, Louis Samuel Foyer was a social philosopher, a sociologist from Berkeley, California, and his wife, Catherine Foyer, who back then was writing a dissertation on Tolstoy and went to Yasna Polyana to work with the archives. She had a side, unofficial task besides her dissertation, to meet someone who got one of the authentic copies of Requiem from Akhmatova. It was Ilan Oxman, who himself spent many years on Kolyma. And now in the thaw period, he was kind of gradually led back to literary activities. He, for example, worked on the literary encyclopedia. He also left behind his journal entries, sharing how he talked to Akhmatova, discussing whether it makes sense to send Requiem to Twardowski. He convinced her she shouldn't. She disagreed. Having the wave, experiencing the wave of hope that Solzhenitsyn publication started. And they were also joined by their 15-year-old daughter, that's all the 4 years. She was a teenager. She spent 5 months in the Ukraine hotel in Moscow. She attended a school in Moscow. Louis gave lectures at the Academy of Science, and the wife and her mother met Oxman, had a discussion with him, not just about Akhmatova, of course, but she gets the manuscript and she gives it to the cultural attaché of that period in the American embassy, and he sends the manuscript over to Gleb Struve in California, who is the immigrant and professor of Slavic studies and the immigrant of first wave, and one of the publishers, one of the key figures for Tamizdat in the 1960s, who knows that Requiem he already knows of Requiem's existence because of his correspondence with the scientists and scholars in Moscow, and once again through the scientific exchange programs. So having received the manuscript, he holds on to it for a very long time, not just sits on it as he wrote himself for some time, because the publication was not authorized, and Akhmatova's figure is of such prominence that her will, her explicit consent was very important for them, and they hoped for its publication in the Soviet Union, and they knew if it comes out in the West first, this will shut the door for the publication in the Soviet Union, which was the primary goal for Akhmatova herself. But then, after several turning points in the spring of 1960, the third, and they've been conversing between Oxman and Struve. So Oxman received a signal that the Requiem poem will not be published in Soviet Union, so he gives the signal to the West, and in November 1963, it's being published in Munich, but not in a prominent publishing house, but not in Posiev. And Akhmatova actually experienced no repercussions for that publication. But in 1965, she made the decision to actually record her reading in 1965. 1965, that's the moment where she read it herself, she recorded, and she asked him not to disseminate, not to spread it, to keep it in the literary museum. So he recorded as a staff member of the literary museum, and she hoped that this would remain there for the future generations, but would not get around this time. Well, in 1965, she actually planned, she tried to include Requiem into the flow of time, or her last publication during her lifetime, but that was not successful. So it's interesting that she, this very same year, she asked to not disseminate the recording while she tried to print it in the collection of her works. That's how I remember it from the story of the person who recorded the voice of Akhmatova. Yeah. The history of every publication and every manuscript is a detective story in itself. Okay, Chukovskaya sends the manuscripts consciously, yes? No, I'm actually quite sure that she actually doesn't know about it herself. About Sofia Petrovna. And in 72? In 72, yes. That's where she's behind the scenes. It's the going under. Yes, but with Sofia Petrovna, she was not aware of this. She was even more desperately trying to get it published, get Sofia Petrovna published in the country, even more desperate attempts than Akhmatova in terms of Requiem. You can read it in her memoirs and her journal, but she didn't know that Sofia Petrovna ends up in Paris. Interestingly, Yuri Annenkov was the person behind it. But that novel actually was published as a separate book, as a separate volume in Paris, with its strange but understandable title. It is called Empty House in its first and it follows the Akhmatova's Requiem, who by then had already been known for 2 years. Because that's the empty house is the expression used in Requiem. So they kind of were trying to ride the wave of Akhmatova's Requiem popularity to get to the mass reader. And because the mass readers were not aware of Chukovskaya or Sofia Petrovna's title, so the title Sofia Petrovna was not catchy enough. It's not even one day of the life of Sofia Petrovna, it's just Sofia Petrovna. But it's obvious whom she addressed. There is a specific classic literary work to which she kind of compares by the author, but obviously by the readers. Do you mean the mother of Gorky? Nevertheless, in the reviews by the immigration, you don't see those comparisons at all. And what do they refer to? What are the reference points? Ivan Denisovich as a background against which everything is now being compared to. Chukovskaya, Ginsburg, and on the other hand, memoirs. So not thematically, but in terms of genre, in terms of this frame of memoirs, which turns out to be very dangerous for the authors of prose on the Gulag topic, because
можно сказать, цензура в Tamizdat, начиная с заглавия, да?
Because the publishers outside of the Soviet Union were kind of not just changing the title, but also kind of a little bit of censoring the text, adapting it towards the reader. So Sofia Petrovna was changed into Olga Petrovna in that first copy. But when they published the Kolyma stories by Shalamov, and that's actually my entry point to the topic of Tamizdat, you can see a clear of getting the story straightened in terms with the goal of understanding them as, well, if not memoirs, but then a photographical information source.
Эти очень радикальные его такие формалистские или формальные свойства его прозы.
And so that drew people's attention, and not the formalistic quality of his prose and formalistic specificity of his prose. So to the first immigration wave, his method was unclear and inaccessible. They didn't have neither the expression, nor could have been the witness of the evolution of the Soviet stylistic and cultural code, especially the ones related to the concentration camps. But on the other hand, it was also related to this solid foundations of the memoirs, and everything else is set on that foundation. Memoirs of the very same immigrants, of course, not just the authors of Tamizdat.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to ask whether there are any questions or comments, because we've been talking for a long time. So if you have a comment or a question, please raise your hand and unmute Ilya. Hello, and thank you for this very interesting conversation. My question is to Yasha. I have a question about the closing paragraph of your book. At the end of the war, from the end of the war, Tamizdat has come back to reality and has brought people back to reality. I just dropped off, but I'm back.
Возвращается к реальности, Tamizdat.
So Tamizdat returns to reality. And you write that in today's era, in the era of the internet, it is going to be completely different. It's going to have very different qualities. And now I'm going to be writing a PhD. And maybe you have some comments on this. If Tamizdat is going to be different, what is the difference going to be? Thank you very much, Ilya.
Это очень странно вдруг, как бы, не то чтобы оказаться внутри своей темы, конечно.
It's very strange to kind of find myself inside of my own topic again. I believe this is the topic of someone who's forced to be published online, the Netizdat, if you like. So what does the word tam mean now? Where is it being published? Where is the server? I suppose where the server is geographically might be important, because a server does have a geographical location as well as a legal location. And this has legal implications.
Требовалось или на что уходило там месяцы, годы.
In the past, it would take months or years to get something published. Back then, it was at the time of the Cold War, but in the situation of today's war, nonetheless, the internet
делает все, по крайней мере, на сегодняшний день еще можно сказать, что делает
in
это
the
всё
present day, the internet makes this a lot more possible and accessible than before.
Руар, наверное, мне кажется, это самый первый вот такой журнал, не журнал, но
Ruar must be one of the first journals
платформа.
or
С тех
platform.
пор за 2 года, конечно, возникло очень много разных инициатив таких.
Over the past 2 years, there have been many very serious initiatives springing up,
Как бы частных.
private initiatives as well. Freedom Letters, for instance.
Георгием Рушадзе книг это
Georgi Rushadze has published so many books. It's absolutely incredible.
Tamizdat, таких тиражей.
Even in the years of Tamizdat, people never saw such a wide repertoire.
Но 3 книжки, которые издала Медуза, например,
The 3 books that Medusa has published,
это уже больше похоже на Tamizdat как
this looks more like Tamizdat, not necessarily as the place where it's published, but as an institution. Because Tamizdat is first and foremost, the Tamizdat of those years is not just about printing a book. It's an institutionalized mechanism. And the very publication of a manuscript from the other side, the other side of the Iron Curtain, was essentially creating a weapon. So because a book was a political weapon, and Tamizdat is a political institution, therefore. So what Medusa is doing at the moment seems most like what that was in the past. There need to be certain resources to have the opportunity to do that. However, their strategies and their instructions are about how to read a book, how to read the book of Lena Kostyuchenko, how those who are still in Russia can read that book is very interesting. We can draw some interesting comparisons. It's like the second cycle of Tamizdat that used to be. Because there used to be several directions in which they went. So it was not only bringing books abroad, but also bringing already published books, like delivering them, disseminating them. These books and journals back into the Soviet Union through the Iron Curtain. Of course, it was dangerous, it was risky. So anyone who's getting published today, Linor Garalik is also thinking about this, but I think that Meduza has come up with more or less a strategy or a mechanism of how people can read those books in places where they are, let's put it so as they are not welcome or they are banned. So we're talking about banned books. This is something that exists in the United States as well. So as a notion, Tamizdat is very, very culturally specific. Or rather, the term and its etymology is very culturally specific. But whatever you choose to call it, Tamizdat is not limited to the Soviet Union. We can look at the example of China, for instance. Let's try and come back to that epoch. Because we can talk about the future, of course, in other contexts. I wasn't really talking about the future, I was rather talking about its geography. Because war is taking place in many different places. There is censorship in many different countries, whether it's state censorship or otherwise. And wherever there are such restrictions, wherever there is war, there is going to be something that resembles Tamizdat, even if we choose a different term for it, even if the term Tamizdat is not really applicable to, let's say, the Ukrainian or Polish or South American context or the Chinese context. It's a terminological issue that I truly don't know what to do with, because I talk to other people about this, to other specialists, to Thomas Venslow. Coming up with a neologism in Lithuanian that could be used to talk about Lithuanian Tamizdat is not so much of an issue. However, these neologisms don't stick and they're not used, whereas Tamizdat is a well-established neologism. In Spanish, for instance, there isn't a single word that you could use to describe this phenomenon. And yet the phenomenon does exist. Are there any questions about this? Any questions about this Tamizdat that Yasha is talking about now? Yes, please.
Захар пришел. Привет, Яша.
Привет.
С книжкой.
Hello,
Я еще
Yasha.
не читал.
I have not read your book yet.
Как раз в этом контексте
In this context, what's interesting,
Tamizdat, или как ты говоришь,
so you're talking about Tamizdat as a weapon.
убивает, а здесь
A weapon is meant to kill,
речь идет об информации.
but here we're talking about information.
Роль или связь, как
what is the role or the connection with the Congress for Cultural Freedom? You've probably come across something of that kind. And the second question, since you're talking about the literature of the camps, so what I'm interested in is the fate of the books of Yulia Margolina, Travel to the Land of Zeka. Can we perform a comparative analysis of that fate of that book and the fate of the books that you discuss in your books? So with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, undoubtedly, it is an essential institution, one of
замаскированные, что ли.
Подпольное.
Ну,
one
подпольные,
of
да.
these covert or underground
Такие ответвления, в общем, ну, ЦРУ и западных
branches of the CIA and Western special services,
выгодные, что ли, в политическом смысле инвестиции.
for whom this was a very useful investment. That's why I'm saying that this was a weapon in the Cold War.
Ну, это параллельно вот этой вообще странной метафоре холодная война, да, то есть если война холодная.
I was using it in the context of the Cold War and its metaphors. Of course, if we're talking about weapons in the Cold War, it's about this kind of soft power.
Вот. Но это к тому, что мне все-таки заниматься Тамиздатом было и остается интереснее как литературной
What I'm
практикой.
saying is I am interested in studying Tamizdat as a literary practice, not only as a political practice.
Заниматься вполне, по-моему, интересно, ну, даже особенно не вдаваясь вот в то, о чем мы говорили в начале.
And I think you can study Tamizdat without really getting deeper into the things that we talked about at the very beginning.
Это немножко просто не моя сфера.
But it's just not my line of work.
Меньше понимаю.
I think I understand
Но
less of all of that.
архивы это всё
However, there are certain archives that are very interesting to go through,
бумаги.
some financial
И
paperwork.
этим можно заниматься людям совершенно разных ну, дисциплин.
And this is something that can be studied by people from various academic disciplines, not only literature,
И не только историки,
not only
экономисты этим
historians, but also economists and political scientists and geographers probably
нет.
can study this as well.
А с Марголиным
As for Margolin,
очень интересный случай. Это как бы не совсем Тамиздат, потому что
it's not
там
quite
нет
Tamizdat,
определения или понимания этого явления, потому что для меня Тамиздат это тексты, которые
because for me, Tamizdat, the texts, not their authors, are those who have at least once crossed the geographical border. Margolin wrote his literature after he immigrated. As far as I remember, he first came to Poland and then to Israel. So his works were written in a place where he was hoping that ultimately he would be published. Interestingly, in Israel, where he lived and wrote these memoirs, it was not possible to publish. For certain internal reasons that had to do with Israeli sensibilities. This has to do with his biography, not so much to do with his style and the way he wrote, but with his views.
Про чувствительность ты сказала, и я
The
вспомнила.
sensitivity that you mentioned and sensitive aspects of the readers. I think we haven't mentioned and we haven't said anything about Sinyavsky, who is the last chapter in your book. Yes, thank you. It's in a way the most interesting part because with a fantastic level of realism.
Куда-то чуть-чуть в другое место, собственно, что и для самого Терца Синявского было важнее всего.
And it was the most crucial point for Tertz Sinyavsky himself. The epilogue of the book, which I really wanted it to be actually a separate chapter about Sinyavsky and Daniel, about this tandem project of theirs, which was the most efficient project of Tamizdat in every way possible, in literary way, in political way.
Прости, пожалуйста, но проект, у проекта должен быть какой-то
The
автор.
project, there has to be a designer of the project, someone who projects it. Here are the authors, plural. Sinyavsky, Tertz. He designed it, unlike in the case of Akhmatova, who was not in charge of the project of publishing her works outside of the Soviet Union. This was their design strategy. So their creativity went not just to writing the stuff, but also into printing it, publishing it as Tamizdat. Not just his, Sinyavsky, but also Daniel's. The author is never alone. He has some assistants and co-authors. For Sinyavsky, the co-authors included Hélène Zamoyska-Pelletier, a daughter of a French diplomat who moved the manuscript to Paris. And then his main publisher from the Polish diaspora, Yasha Klots, publisher of Kultura magazine and head of the Literary Institute in Poland. I didn't have enough space or time for the book, so it only speaks of that story as just in the epilogue with one story about an alien who, after his spaceship crash, where he went on holidays from one planet to another one, and everyone died in that crash, he was the only one survived, and he lives in a communal shared apartment in Moscow, and he hopes to return to where the crash happened and to leave the Earth.
Но это уже частности, это скорее про иммиграцию и про лагерную тему, тут все вместе.
There's both the topic of immigration and the Gulag, and together because it's a fantasy story. Everyone loves socialist realism, and here the author who talks about and has the author opposes the socialist realism. How was this perceived and received? But no one knew who was that Tertz author and who wrote this essay on socialism. No one knew it was Sinyavsky who wrote his dissertation on Gorky. But you know that in the Literary Institute, they actually realize it's one of their staff, because they gathered the staff members, because we can clearly see by the style that this is one of ours. But since 1957, for many years, no one could guess who that was. And they were very wild guesses, both in the immigration and within the Soviet Union. For 8 years, from 1957 to 65, that was the most successful secret operation, conspiracy. Who were the readers? Who were the readers who loved the Tertz works? For these specific reasons, everyone was more just curious. His fantasy works were sci-fi. His prose was not loved, but more people were curious about it in the immigration. And what kind of love are we talking about it in anyways? But I'm interested in love. We don't have much time left, but like, let's try to fit love here. In 1963, in January, there's the love for love to Solzhenitsyn. When his letter comes to the Congress of Social Writers, is his letter makes an impression? Is the reader abroad impressed by that? Love as a romantic interest towards Solzhenitsyn and emigration gradually becomes a marriage in that particular case. Something insoluble, something that was a marriage that actually crashed everything on its way. So that's actually my question, because Solzhenitsyn builds the connections. He builds the context, even though he was not him who sent his manuscript, the first important manuscript, but he started building up the network of context very early. Were there others who worked similarly, who had this strategy in the 60s and the early 70s? And I'm not sure I understand you. Well, Solzhenitsyn tried to get in touch with Struve, with the Russian Christian movement's Vesnik messenger, to agree on the publication. So it's this concept of not just being published, but actually having ties, connections, and growing something, doing on the basis of that. Was that anyone else's strategy besides Solzhenitsyn? Well, of course, that was done in the following years. In the third wave of immigration in the 70s and the 80s, this was much more common strategy. But I'm just mean that when Solzhenitsyn emigrated, he already had the basis, the grounds ready for him. Nevertheless, he's actually the one who didn't intend to emigrate. But the contacts were there. Strategy on the likes of the one of Solzhenitsyn, you can't find it anywhere else from those years at least. Later on, yes, when Ardis comes into being, when much closer contact between the authors and the publishers over the borders is facilitated. And so through Nadezhda Mandelstam, or through Brodsky, or through many more people, there is a network being established, woven, and the correspondence, for example, with Skopelev. In the early years of Tamizdat, it was not there, and even in the case of Solzhenitsyn, it's very interesting. And I don't think it was described well enough by Solzhenitsyn himself or anyone else. But it's a large area, and I didn't tackle it seriously enough. I didn't concentrate on Solzhenitsyn Tamizdat seriously enough. We have a question from Ekaterina Vasilyeva. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I had a question. You said that in your book you are referring as the Tamizdat starting point as 1962 as the publication of Ivan Denisovich. But I wanted to ask, do you have a moment when Tamizdat was finished, or it was a gradual end of that phenomenon, or was there final publication, or there was a culmination, like a final break moment of Tamizdat, after which that phenomenon was already dying out? Yes, thank you. On the one hand, the 1962, because I don't want to be misunderstood, 1962 was not a beginning of Tamizdat. It was the beginning of Tamizdat in relation to the concentration camps situation. In that thematic area, that was. But then the first Tamizdat was Gerzen, probably, or at least Zanettin in 1929. If we're looking at the Soviet period, Me by Zanettin, the first anti-utopic novel that was published only outside of the Soviet Union, and it's a whole separate area. It's very important for me because for me today it's important to broaden the limits and the time boundaries of Tamizdat, both in historically and culturally linguistically. For example, Orwell. Orwell's manuscripts were not intended to move across that border, but 1984, for example, was one of the hottest texts of the Cold War, and I think there are more imprisoned people for 1984 than for Archipelago Gulag. So, in a way, within the country, this was joining that Tamizdat conversation.
Это когда цензура, советская цензура прекращает на время, да, ну, то есть советская навсегда существовать. Все...
As the end, we can give the year when the Soviet censorship ended. And the majority of the camps-related Requiem, Sofia Petrovna, 84, and Kolyma stories, all of that sees the light in 88, sometimes in 87, but 88, 89 is being published in huge number of copies in Soviet Union still, and during the perestroika, and then in the 90s. In the 90s, there was already no Tamizdat. What could have been the last culmination of that phenomenon? I don't think that was a single thing. It was a distributed. It's naturally wrapped up, or it's kind of actually these two streams of the same river merged. They reconnected. They circumvented the island of the Soviet era, and they got back to flowing together. But remembering Ilya's question, is really Tamizdat a phenomenon of the past? Because history tends to repeat. Because the thought period, for example, was a period when a lot of things were possible and a lot of things were published at home. And but today we can talk about the thought of the post-Soviet period of the 90s. I know it's not a very clear and ambiguous terminology, and we can't describe the modernity with the previous terms.
Можно ли, вот такой у меня вопрос, можно ли сказать...
My question is it possible to say, if we're talking about Tamizdat and not about some further iterations and publications, would it be fair to say that these authors that you write about, the Requiem of Akhmatova was not read in the same way, or could we say that the attitudes towards these authors changed with further publications? Can we see some kind of evolution, some kind of timeline? Or do we say that each author is associated with a number of cliches? Let's say she disowned us in 1917. Or is it not possible to talk about Tamizdat in this way at all? This is a really interesting question. I think We could look at it from different angles.
Солженицын, конечно, прогремел в 62-м, но
In 1962, Solzhenitsyn made a huge resonance. And when the Gulag Archipelago was published, this decade, these 12 years in which this happened, there was this increase. But that was just the one person, wasn't it? I need to think. This is interesting. To what extent? To what extent did Tamizdat create the conditions for growth or vice versa, for a reduction in popularity? Let's say there are critics now, and we know about these critics that some of these kind of revere some of these authors. So we might say that there's a certain literary field that either contributes to the popularity of an author or vice versa, contributes to a loss of interest. I think I know how to answer this. This is concerned with the fact that Tamizdat has always responded to what was happening within the country. This was inevitable, even Gertsen. So there was a lot of variability, and it depended on the situation within the country. An example that comes to mind is Yevtushenko, Viznesensky, Rождественский. People were amazed by them for a very short period of time. They were the only people, the only writers that people would write about, and then all of a sudden this fame was gone. This was not because Yevtushenko lost his popularity in the Soviet Union. When he published The Heirs of Stalin in Pravda in 1961, he reached such a height, just like Solzhenitsyn did. But Solzhenitsyn was able to hold on to that fame and increase it. With Yevtushenko, however, things didn't, well, I can't say they went downhill, but for some reason, his popularity and fame only remained for about 3 years. So 1961 was Baby Yar, then The Heirs of Stalin. There was some very big works by him. Yes, but by 1965, his popularity was in a slump. This is an interesting way of looking at it. I hadn't thought of it before. Because it was a political institute, and certain reputational issues were quite important when we talk about these hierarchies and anything institutionalized and these mechanisms. It's something that I still need to think about. Are there any other questions? So far, I don't see any questions. Zakhar?
Нужно звук включить.
Да, спасибо за ответ. Нет.
Thank you for your answer. Yuri Margolins. He was published in 1963. And this was the Samizdat that you talk about. Yeah, it's interesting. He was not able to be published. 53. He was not able to be printed in Israel, so he was printed in New York in 1954. In that sense, you're right. that it was a matter of time. Right after the war, people didn't want to talk about it, but after 1956, the situation changed. Well, with your help, I pretty much responded to my own question. Thank you.
Есть ли еще вопросы?
Are there any other questions?
Тогда, может быть, и я задам вопрос.
In that case, I would like to ask a question.
Ты говоришь о начале Тамиздата, ты называешь
You talk about the beginnings of Tamizdat and you talk about Gertsen.
в этом контексте.
Why do we mention Gertsen in this context?
Обращались в этом качестве вот издательство имени
The reason is that
Беленков готовится
the Gertsen publishers and Belenkov,
актуализировали в этом качестве, да?
in this sense, he was kind of actualized.
Сходство, кроме того, что вот человек находится за
Or
границей,
is there any other similarity apart from the fact that he was abroad and he tried to bring the works that he was publishing back into Russia? I was reading these open letters, and it's Kurbsky and Grozny that start this legacy of open letters, and that's great that there's such a kind of a prehistory, but it doesn't really have to do with the time that we are describing. Why do we need this comparison? If we think of Krupski, I'm not sure about that. I think it's more about, an exchange of letters. But why Gertsen? I think we are talking about the same things. Why was Gertsen actualized in the 1960s? If we open his letter to the brothers in Rus, so that was published 100 years before the death of Stalin, so 1856. It's a very curious and queer cycle that's taking place. But it's true that 100 years down the road, people felt that what he had written was echoed in what they were seeing around them. This kind of manifesto of free Russian press is a direct address to the authors in the Russia of Tsar Nicholas. Send in your publications. Our doors are open. If you don't want to be published, that's on you. I would like to say that this is not so much an echo as a search for a precedent and a foundation and a support. I agree with you. We can talk about what an echo or a rhyme is. Twardowski needs Dostoevsky when he writes One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. He needs to defend this author. Gertsen enters the Soviet period after the revolution. And he's kind of like the holy cow of Gossizdat. He was the primary Tamizdat person in Tsarist Russia. The demon by Lermontov also had a similar fate. It was later reappropriated and reinterpreted. I understand that what I'm saying now is an oversimplification. But yes, Gertsen does carry a sort of political function in all of this. It is the wing of Gertsen
которое можно взять
under which
или что-то уже как бы советской эпохи.
some later Soviet authors
Биографию о Герцене в
could
56 году.
find refuge
В это
in,
время, ну, практически
such as
отдал
Lydia
Герцену,
Chukovskaya.
ну, где новые Герцены? Почему
Like
их
Klotzman
нет?
writes to Struve, where are the new Hertzens? Why don't we see them? In Amsterdam, there's a publishing house, the Hertzen Foundation, that publishes works by dissidents. The New Bell by Vilimkov. Lydia Chukovskaya in the 1960s keeps writing about the Polish uprisings in the 19th century. And that's not to say about Tsarist censorship and Soviet censorships as institutions, how one continues the legacy of the other. I think we are going to leave that outside the brackets of our conversation today. Do we have any other questions? Because our time is running out. So if you have a question or a comment, then this is the best time to do it. Maybe you want to disagree with something. So what is an important thing that I didn't ask you? What is one thing that you would like us to know about your book? The book was written exactly 3 years ago. And normally at the presentations of my book, I talk about what's not included in the book. If I was writing it now, the book would look different. I would have a chapter on Zametin about 1929, the end of the new economic policy, and the press in the Soviet Union back then. And the next thing is connected to the Tamizdat project that I run together with my students and volunteers. This is something we've been working on for the entire summer. I would like to talk about Orwell, Huxley, like non-Soviet and non-Eastern, so to speak, Tamizdat. Or like Joyce, that was it was not possible to publish them in the Soviet Union. However, they were translated, they were sent to the Soviet Union. So we see the same actors of the cultural field that we associate with Tamizdat. So that's also fascinating, although we see different literary traditions, languages, and audiences. The Eastern European audience of Animal Farm. And recently I've been spending more and more time thinking about whether books and magazines that were published after the war by displaced persons, are they considered Tamizdat? And even during the war on occupied territories, parts of Requiem were published there first, like pro-Nazi magazines on occupied territories, in Russian-speaking magazines. And Akhmatova did not know about this, of course, and thank God she didn't know it. So is that Tamizdat? That's another area for exploration.
поворотов или таких вот.
There are many more interesting twists and turns
Мне интереснее сейчас, на которые мне интереснее сегодня смотреть, чем
that I'm interested in
типа
looking at
Живаго или даже.
as compared to, let's say, something mainstream like Dr. Zhivago or even Lydia
Спасибо.
Chukovskaya. Thank you.
Я тебя перебила.
Всем до свидания.
Спасибо большое, Яша. Спасибо большое
Thank you very much to Yasha
пришедшим
and to
сегодня.
all of you who've joined us today.
Ну и хороших вам каникул.
Have a
успешных
wonderful
немецких. И до
holiday if you're in
встречи
Germany, and
в
see you soon in April.